Welcome back. Now we're going to discuss the modern impacts of Baltimore Apartheid. In previous sections, we've discussed how the landscape of policies and practices have created and intensified racial segregation here in Baltimore City, and also how policies have been used to uproot and forcibly displace with the force of law, African Americans here in Baltimore City. And this sort of dual policy landscape of segregation and serial forced displacement being displaced over and over and over again has had damaging impacts, especially as it relates to health. In fact, Mindy Fullilove, a professor at Columbia University, she talks about root shock and how being displaced from one's community actually induces a sort of emotional trauma. It takes away people's ability sometimes to maintain their sense of identity the way they used to have it because the people they knew and loved aren't maybe living around them anymore. And so those policies and practices have had a tremendous impact. Segregation in Baltimore is persisting, as you saw in the introduction, in that first map in the presentation. And forced displacement, I've calculated, has impacted over 25,000 Black families here in Baltimore City, which could be over 100,000 African Americans impacted by serial forced displacement overall. So we're talking about huge numbers of people impacted by both segregation and serial forced displacement. But how does that play out today? Well, I've created this chart that sort of shows how the white L benefits from structured advantage today and how the black butterfly loses in many ways due to structured disadvantage. You may become familiar with something called the Charm City Circulator, which is free for its riders, but it only operates in the white L. And there's a Hopkins sort of wing that barely crosses through, but it's predominantly a white L circulator. Whereas people who ride the buses from the Maryland Transit Authority, those riders must pay. The highways, they were built for easy access to downtown, but of course they cause displacement in the African American community, especially the Highway to Nowhere, US 40. We have tax increment financing. I could show you another map if you look at other presentations that I've done where our tax increment financing is predominantly in the white L or with projects that are controlled by institutions like Hopkins or Kevin Plank, who's the CEO for Under Armour, and his real estate division called Sagamore Development. So these are sort of economic development policies and practices that we're doing right now today that really don't benefit hardly at all Black communities. The one tax increment financing that has done, I think, a magnificent job is at Mondawmin Mall. That TIF was maybe $17.5 million, and that has actually done a great job of revitalizing the Mondawmin area. But the TIFs in the Black community are far and few between. Enterprise zones have a very differential impact, primarily because we don't really ensure that those enterprise zones are even located in the Black community. If you look at maps from the Baltimore Development Corporation, redlining is still taking place. So banks aren't lending in Black communities, and I'll show you that map shortly. So instead, in Black communities today, we have check cashing facilities, payday lending facilities, pawn shops, these highly predatory, exploitative financial institutions. So because the banks are still redlining today, as I'll show you in a moment, home mortgage lending, those applications are not being originated for Black home buyers in those Black neighborhoods. Small business lending is disproportionate as well, which means that Black businesses aren't expanding, or Black-owned businesses have a smaller chance of expanding so they can hire workers in those neighborhoods, reduce unemployment. There's also the subprime lending that takes place in Black neighborhoods. There was a paper by Jacob Rue and his colleagues that discussed how 3,000 plus mortgages from Wells Fargo in Baltimore City between 2000 and 2008 resulted in Black home buyers paying $15,000 to $16,000 more than their white counterparts for their mortgages, even after statistically controlling for down payments and credit scores and other factors. And so subprime lending, which means you have to pay more, even African Americans who have higher credit scores would be targeted for these subprime schemes having a very negative impact. What can you do with the extra $15,000 that you may be losing when you're paying more because of discriminatory bank lending? Policing, you may have heard, is a huge issue here. We've had lots of exposés and news stories around everything from police brutality to rough rides to zero tolerance and stop and frisk policies that take place in Black communities. The white L, not so much. Public housing is disproportionately concentrated and found in Black communities. If you go to Roland Park, Guilford, Homeland, Northwood, Canton, you will not find much public housing there. Our Section 8 or housing choice voucher residents are disproportionately concentrated in Black neighborhoods, not so much in white neighborhoods. It's on we could go, but there are structured advantages for communities that are in the white L versus those that are in the Black butterfly. So here's the map for redlining. The National Community Reinvestment Coalition, NCRC, published a report in 2015 showing that bank redlining is still taking place. Now you can sort of see maybe in to the east and west of Baltimore within the boundary, what I'm calling the Black butterfly. Those lending dots are very, very small in Black neighborhoods. And then if you look at the L, down the center of the Baltimore city and then going east to the county, that's where most of the lending is taking place. And this is in the past 5 years, between 2011 and 2013. So what we're talking about is a situation where redlining still persists, as the New York Times article called Biased Lending Evolves discusses. It says bankers no longer talk about openly denying loans to Black people. Instead, some banks have just quietly institutionalized their operations, deliberately placing branches, brokers, and mortgage services outside of minority communities. And there's a quote, "It is like a whole other world," one lending executive told examiners from the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, explaining why the banks failed to generate mortgage applications from a minority neighborhood here. Fallout from the excesses of the subprime era and mortgage lending has, in some ways, set the stage for the discriminatory practices of today. And so these practices persist. It's one thing to have a law. We have a law that outlawed redlining, the 1968 Fair Housing Act, but it's another thing to enforce that law. And you will find in America that oftentimes the laws that we have are not enforced equally. And that allows segregation, that allows forced displacement, that allows apartheid in often cases to persist in our city. Here's an example of that. You have the bicycle survey that was conducted for the 2015 Baltimore City Bicycle Master Plan. And look at who they surveyed. They surveyed people living in the white L. There's virtually, just look at the darker areas of this map, hardly are very few participants from East and West Baltimore zip codes, but plenty in the white L zip codes. Here's the Charm City Circulator I was telling you about earlier. If you can see sort of, there's like this sort of fanciful colors. You got like some blue, yellows, green, and red, and purples. But outside of the circulator where it runs, there's like gray. It like grays out the rest of the city. Like it just really doesn't exist. So the map is sort of telling you something very interesting in and of itself. And you can see as we zoom out from that Charm City Circulator, like how it services that sort of downtown, midtown, Fed Hill corridor around the waterfront, and then that green to the right, which services Johns Hopkins campus, the orange services University of Maryland campus. And so this is really an advantageous, a structured advantage, where this is a free bus system for people living in the downtown, midtown, Fed Hill corridor, and then those attending University of Maryland and also Johns Hopkins. So, for instance, this doesn't service historically Black colleges and universities like Coppin State and Morgan State. Our students don't have the luxury of this service. And so you can see, if you actually look at the Zipcar map as well. Now, Zipcar is a service that is authorized by the city of Baltimore to operate in our city. They give them the license to operate. But if you look at the map of the car sharing locations in Baltimore, again, it forms a near perfect L in the white L. So again, people living in the Black Butterfly in East and West Baltimore, they do not have access to this service. They could not originate. They couldn't find a station in their community to begin their journey. And so when you look at the map showing the percentage of commuters spending 45 or more minutes traveling to work, it's no surprise then, based on the transportation advantages that we see in the white L, that people living in the Black Butterfly have to travel a longer length of time in order to get to work. And we can see that very clearly in this map. So when you have a Charm City circulator, when you have a zip car, when you have bicycle master plan, which will inform the creation of a program called Bike Share in the white L as well, it allows you to shorten your time tremendously, your travel time tremendously, whereas people living in the Black Butterfly are having to travel much longer length of time in order to obtain or to reach work. So we've talked about segregation then and serial forces placement in multiple sectors. We've talked about it in education. We've talked about it in transportation. We've talked about it in housing. And so these multiple sectors contribute then to the type of scenario that we have today. And you can see in this model by Elizabeth Anderson and Jeffrey Jones, the process by which segregation leads to poverty. And it moves sort of left to right. You can have white flight and housing discrimination, policies that lead to that. And then that sort of codifies and leads to segregation, racial segregation that we discussed earlier, leading to these other impacts. Affirmative action, as Ira Katznelson wrote a book called When Affirmative Action Was White. A tremendous book because it discusses like these policies, the GI Bill, the United States Department of Agriculture loans, the highways, and all these policies that advantage people living in suburbs, advantage whites in our nation, disadvantage blacks in our nation because they did not have access to these particular loans and policies. And so you have the creation of these racially disparate neighborhoods in cities where white neighborhoods matter, but black neighborhoods don't matter. You have fewer banks that invest in black neighborhoods, lower housing values in black neighborhoods, separation from people who influence policy. You have a lower tax base, less funding for education, poorer job opportunities, longer travel times to reach those jobs, as we just discussed. Businesses moving out, fewer new business starting, again, because of redlining, banks denying loans or not originating loans for those communities. And so you end up with a situation where you have high poverty. So this is a process. Poverty is a process, not a condition. Poverty is something that is created and influenced and intensified by policies and practices here in Baltimore City. It's not an individual attribution. It is a social condition, a social function of policies and practices. And it leads to the very right of the model here, where I've modified it to say that we have police that are an occupying force, as James Baldwin once said in 1966 in a Nation article, in black neighborhoods, and they engage oftentimes in brutality. We have apartheid schools. Nearly 1/3 of our schools are 99% black or more. Over half of our schools are 99% children of color. And so all of this leads to high poverty, in many ways due to the wealth extraction from black communities. I often say that racial segregation is an economic system. Racial segregation is an economic system, and in many ways, forced displacement does the same as well. It's a punitive economic system. And so you can see on this slide where the block figures are standing, a wealthy neighborhood and a black neighborhood. And the black couple on the left of the diagram saying, could we get a loan for this neighborhood? And then the white gentleman, a real estate broker or banker perhaps, says, we can't give you a loan. You can afford this though. So that's like racial steering, and showing how like the real estate broker or bankers are landlords who participate in this system. You can see the couple asking, could I use the restroom? And he's saying the colored restrooms are that way in the black neighborhood. And so it's just sort of how this steering, how this exclusionary practices in many ways are maintained in our society today. And so once you understand all of these practices and policies, once you understand that poverty is not an individual attribution, it is a result, it is a process of social construction here in Baltimore City, then you are able to understand in many ways why health disparities exist in our city. It is not people not wanting to eat correctly. It's not people not wanting to exercise. It's not people making bad choices. It's people growing up and living in neighborhoods that have been structurally disadvantaged for decade after decade after decade, for indeed over a century, since 1910. And so that helps us to understand this backdrop is very important in order to understand what is happening in Baltimore City. So thank you for joining me this section. Join me for the next section, Solutions and Conclusions.